Coming off the heels of the fiasco of Season 8 this past summer, and all that we've had to endure, it gives me a different perspective of this title than I might have had a year or two ago, or 5 or 6 years ago. And this is probably one of the best adaptations of a literary world in video games. It's not a direct translation of source material, but instead follows more of a telltale approach. Cyanide's game is set in Westeros and the broader landscape of George R.R. Martin's A Song of Fire and Ice, but translates very little of the author's work into this interactive medium. And this game does a far better job of adding to the Westeros canon than Telltale's A Game of Thrones did. So how was Cyanide Studios able to achieve this? What is the 2012 Game of Thrones all about? And I think the answers to these questions go hand in hand because of how it interweaves the stories of the two knights that partook in Robert's Rebellion. We have Sir Alistair Sarwyck and Sir Mors Westford. And this game is about the consequences of what occurred during Robert Baratheon's war against the Targaryens, which is the prelude to the HBO series, the book, and this game. There are two stories here. The story of Alistair and the story of Mors, and each start in different regions of the continent. Alistair has just returned from Essos to his family's lands at River Springs, and Mors is a recruiter for the Night's Watch, working out of Castle Black at the Wall. One thing I immediately noticed is the decision to place both our protagonists under the broader House Lannister. Tywin Lannister is, I think, the most referenced lord in the entire game outside of the Crown. We aren't Starks and Northmen or some of the most sympathetic forces in this game. We are the knights who worked under the man who ordered the mountain to strangle children. The interconnected storyline gives this game its interesting and dynamic flair and allows each character to gain a foundation in their separate storylines before slowly starting to inch towards one another. We're not really following a house or a family, but two men who are trying to live with the consequences of their actions. The story is very grounded, and I think invokes Martin's world building and writing far better than other titles have attempted. This is one story in the greater struggle, but it's so tense with such stakes that you almost seem to forget the macro conflict in the game's backdrop. The story, in today's age where there's a lot of shallow decision making in big releases, is honestly nostalgic of older RPGs, and just in general a good experience. There are no cheeky indicators about what decisions matter and what do not, and choices sometimes don't have immediate effects. So when serious conversations emerge in the game, I started to panic. I think whenever a game's writing makes you hum and haw for more than a few seconds, that means that the narrative fork is probably pretty effective. Am I going to side with the lords or am I going to side with the peasants? And obviously, I don't know how this is going to implicate not just this chapter, but later chapters. And throughout the game, I was definitely faced with many deliberations about how I wanted Alistair and Mors to navigate the bloodbath of Westerosi politicking. And I fully expected at some point to value one character's storyline over the other, but surprisingly, I found myself enjoying each. Both characters have simple motivations and simple characterization, but this is what made them so compelling. Alistair lived in exile since the events of the rebellion, and he returns home, wants to be lord, and is challenged in this by his bastard brother. And so he's doing everything that he can to claim his land and his title. Mors is a gruff, honorable recruiter working at the Wall who is blunt and does what he believes is right regardless of consequence. And so when Jon Arryn sends him on a mission, he is honor-bound to complete the task. But while Alistair and Mors are memorable protagonists, some of the side characters are less interesting. While I enjoy the antagonist of the game, Velar, the bastard brother, but something about his name just bothered me. And I did like Jane Greystone and Alanya Sarwyck and Lord Harlton, but I thought Lord Varys' insertion was kind of uninspiring, and the side characters weren't really fleshed out. And there is legitimate criticism that this is a male-dominated story, which is really unlike the source material of Martin's world. You could make the argument that women in Game of Thrones serve as catalysts for the driving stories of Alistair and Mors, and they don't really function as characters in their own right. They get acted upon, but they don't really act. But my biggest gripe with the storyline is how sluggish it moves in the early chapters. While I understand the need to set some foundation to our two main characters, I felt the pace was glacial in the beginning, especially in comparison to the later chapters. With 16 chapters in total, and I clocked in at around 17 hours, Game of Thrones is a fairly solid RPG in terms of length and stuff to do. However, the problem lies in that the story really doesn't start heating up and getting interesting until around chapter 6 or 7. And then there are several important climaxes that make you start to question when this game is really actually going to finally reach its ultimate confrontation. I'm not saying that the game is too long, but the pacing was off. When Game of Thrones gets good with cliffhangers and drama and violence and death, it gets good. I just wish we got to the meat of the story sooner. And while I immensely enjoyed the storyline, that doesn't mean that Game of Thrones is always enjoyable. The character creation and attributes and whatnot is exciting, but the RPGness of the game is a total mixed bag. The trait system is really the most interesting bit, giving you the ability to choose strengths at the cost of flaws, and the ability to unlock new traits that are reflective of your decision making. But at the same time, the skill tree, the inventory, and the abilities are all pretty standard. The most nuanced the game gets is managing the timing of abilities with interrupts, as well as keeping track of armor types of enemies and using the best weapon types against them. But all of this leans more into the standard action RPG territory than offering anything new or exciting. And as the game goes on, the repetitive nature of character building and combat starts to become more blatant. Nothing is very interesting once you get halfway through the game. I mean, each character has kind of two unique systems attached to them. Alistair is a red priest, and of course he's got some firebending going on, and can see things that are hidden from, plain sight. And Mors is a skin changer, and can stealth kill guards with his big pit bull. Things get stale. The combat is lifted from this kind of auto-attack insert ability every once in a while system from games like KOTOR and Dragon Age. But what's noticeable here and what distinguishes Game of Thrones from those titles is that you don't really have cool magic or varied classes or a party system, which is what makes this system work better in games like Dragon Age. But I don't think this is even really the biggest problem. Combat, objectively and isolated from the narrative structure, is fine, it's whatever, it's serviceable. The problem is how combat starts to bloat some of the later chapters down needlessly. As I was saying, when the story gets good, it gets good, and you just kind of want to see more of it. You want to see what's going to happen to these characters. And when your combat systems just aren't that great, it feels like a chore to fight through 3 different mobs of guards in between dialogue actions, just because you need to. It feels like padding. It makes me just want to rush through and just get to what the next part is so I can learn more about what the story is. So I think the story is pretty great, borderline phenomenal, but it's bogged down by unnecessary mediocre combat. What about the rest of the game? Well, it's certainly dated. The music has a riff off of the scores of the HBO series and outright uses the main opening number in the main menu. The sound design is a little janky sometimes. The graphics are dated. The character models are really kind of ugly and copy-pasted outside of our 2 main protagonists. I did, however, appreciate the environmental design of the multiple locales, and as a big fan of George R. R. Martin's world, this is perhaps where some of my bias seeps in, because it was just really cool seeing a different interpretation of Castle Black and King's Landing. The dual storylines also meant that we were hopping back and forth between different environments, which did keep things fresh. There were, however, too many dungeons sometimes and winding tunnels, and coupled with an awful mini-map, sometimes it meant navigation and backtracking was just a painful experience. And then in terms of Game of Thrones tidbits and fan servicey stuff, we see a few characters with their actual voices straight from the HBO series. I won't give away the rest of them, but I did mention that Lord Varys makes an appearance. There's also a few references to A Song of Fire and Ice. There's a new and interesting storyline that does fit so beautifully into the canon of Robert's Rebellion and the end of the Targaryens. So if you're a fan of the show and book series, I think you'll find something to appreciate here. So where does that all leave us with the final score? And this is hard. Honestly, if you had asked me for some kind of summative evaluation by chapter 14, I probably would have said neutral. Like, this is a big positive if you like RPGs and games with a strong emphasis on story, or if you're a big fan of the show. But the last 2 chapters were pretty incredible, and not something I've seen in video games often. It was so Martin-esque, unlike other adaptations of Game of Thrones. Like, this nailed what I think the essence of George R.R. Martin's kind of style of writing. Which means I want to say positive. Yeah, this game gets a positive score from Questmarker, so I strongly encourage you to go give it a try. I don't think it will be time wasted, and if you're looking for something to fill the void after the disaster that was Season 8, there's something here. And let me know, if or when you beat this game, what you thought of the final 2 chapters. I'm so interested to hear what you chose and what you felt, and sometimes I just wish we could gush and rant and rave about video game endings far more often than we do. So, please tell me. Tweet at me, send me an email. I don't know. But talk to me about Alistair and Moors. And until then, I'll see you guys next time.